Good evening, everyone. Before we start tonight, I just want to ask everyone to silence their cell phones, and also point out that if you need to use the restrooms, if you go out of the back of the auditorium, to the right is the boys/men's room, to the left is the girls/women's room. So be careful as you're walking. There's lighted aisles, but be careful because we'll be dimming the lights during certain points of the ceremony. Thank you, everybody, for attending tonight. My name is Chris Moriello. I'm the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Salem State University. We welcome you to our Yom HaShoah commemoration. For people who don't know what the center is, the center was established at Salem State University in 2014 after over 30 years being part of this Peabody community at the Holocaust Center of Boston North. The center is committed to academic, educational, and community work and research on Holocaust, the comparative genocide, and mass violence. Yom HaShoah has been and remains the signature event of our program year. It has always been a solemn commemoration of the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews who perished and the millions of others who suffered and were made refugees. As a research and education center, our program reflects the broader meaning of the event to bring the whole community of all faiths, backgrounds, and beliefs together to remember the universal lessons of the Holocaust with the goal of combating racism, ethnic hatred, and prejudice. This past summer, we watched torchlight parades in Charlottesville, Virginia, with white supremacist mobs marching, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." We have witnessed a 60% rise in anti-Semitic acts in our own Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and a 30% increase in hate crimes in the United States since 2015. Since I'm a historian, I will tell you that comes from the Southern Poverty Law Center. This week, we watched with horror the chlorine gas bombing in Syria, where we saw children suffering and dying in front of our eyes. We no longer can say never again, as these atrocities and human rights abuses continue every day. But we are charged to do more. We must make the lessons of the Holocaust relevant to a new generation of citizens. And we're very pleased tonight that if you look around the audience and you see the program tonight, that we really have made an effort and an outreach to bring young people here to this event, to have teachers and students lead the way as the next generation that will help us confront these human rights abuses. At this time, I ask everyone to please stand for the presentation of the colors and the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner. The presentation of the colors is done by the VFW post in Peabody. On this occasion, they represent the 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee Division, liberators of Mauthausen and concentration camps in Austria and in Germany. The music tonight is by the Salem Community Chorus at SSU, directed by Lynn Shane, with Eugene Foss accompanying on piano. Presentation of the colors, please.
Forward, hot. Right? Hey. Hey.
Post. Precinct, hung. Order, hung. Left, peak. Forward, march.
Please remain standing as survivors, family members of survivors, as well as students from Salem State University come down the aisle of the candle lighting ceremony. At this time, I'd like to invite Gail Goldstein to come up and provide a reading.
I read this tonight in blessed memory of... I'm reading this tonight in blessed memory of my legacy partner, Golda Greenbaum, who passed this July, door to door, from generation to generation. We who lived through hell, and you who know us well, we form a bond beyond the norm eternally. You must not weep, you must not fear. We do not sleep, we are here to guide your hand, and when the last of us is gone, you'll understand and carry on. By the wisdom of your mind, by the power of your heart, you are sensitive and smart. You'll find a way, and so we bestow the hope, the trust, the future, the past upon you, and indeed upon your seed.
At this time, I'd like to introduce some of our public figures. First, I'd like to recognize some of our political representatives who are here. Provost David Silva from Salem State University, Mayor Betancourt, the Mayor of Peabody, Representative Tom Walsh from the Mass State House, Representatives Ted Spiliotis, also from the Mass State House, Mayor McGee, Mayor of Lynn, Representative Crichton, who will try to be here, I'm not sure if he's here, and Herb Levine, Superintendent of Peabody Schools. So we'd like to thank them for their special effort to be here tonight to represent. Everybody can sit. At this time, I'd like to introduce and bring up on stage Provost David Silva from Salem State University. He has been an advocate for the center on campus, and if you know how significant the provost is, having the provost in your corner is a very important part of and for our programming that we do. So thank you, David.
How embarrassing. It's like that scene from When Harry Met Sally. So a little embarrassed, but I am the provost at Salem State. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank you all for being here tonight. At Salem State, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies plays a very important role in ensuring that the lessons to be learned of history are learned. It gives our students the opportunity to learn not only from the past, but as many of you may know, there's an active program in which students have the opportunity to study the kinds of atrocities that are going on today, with an annual trip, for example, to Rwanda. And our students get to see firsthand the kinds of things that can happen in the world to make sure that people are paying attention and that people are responding. Salem State, since its inception, has been all about education and social justice. We were started as a normal school with an understanding that education would be the great equalizer. This is really mad. Would be the great equalizer. And since then, we've expanded as we've become a state college and then a state university with the specialization in the so-called helping professions, in education, in nursing, in social work, in occupational therapy, but always being very true to our roots in preparing people broadly in the arts and the sciences, including the liberal arts and humanities. I want to thank you all very much for being here tonight, and I would be remiss if I did not thank my colleague, Professor Moriello, and his crack team with faculty fellows who make sure that we continue to understand and absorb the lessons of the Holocaust, that we understand the reality that is genocide, and that we are raising up a generation of students, of young people who will not only never forget, but will strive to make sure never again. Thank you very much for inviting me here tonight.
We're also very lucky to have with us Mayor Betancourt from Peabody, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that Peabody has a very special place in the history of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. The City of Peabody hosted the Center, Holocaust Center Boston North, our predecessor here, for 35 years. A series of mayors have been instrumental in making that happen, and Mayor Betancourt is the most recent one. Mayor Betancourt.
Good evening. I'm very honored to be here today on behalf of the City of Peabody to welcome all of you to our 2-year-old Higgins Middle School. I like saying the new Higgins Middle School, but it's a couple years old now, so I'll say the 2-year-old middle school. But it's wonderful to have so many people here tonight. I wanted to thank our honored veterans for being a part of the ceremony. And I also wanted to recognize from the City of Peabody, our City Councilor Tom Gould, who's here today, and also from our school committee, Jared Hockman, who's also with me. When I'm here at the ceremony, I often think of when I was a junior in high school. I was 17 years old, and we were at the Peabody High School in the auditorium, and we had Sonia Whites speak to our class. And I was just one of hundreds, thousands of students that heard her story and heard her message, and it really left a powerful impact on me. Being a young man, a boy in many respects, I didn't realize how evil can take hold and destroy and affect so much of what's beautiful in our world. And it was very powerful for me to hear her story and hear her message, and it definitely left a lasting impact. And now as a leader in our city, I want to make sure that I play a role in continuing her message and continuing things that she told us about. Very recently, we've gathered the Peabody Clergy Association, and we're in the very early stages of creating a talking and listening sessions for our community, revolving around the issues of racism and prejudice and discrimination, police and citizen relationships. And I'm very excited about that project and what we're going to be working on. I think it will be kind of rolled out in the fall, and I'm very excited about the future for that. And a lot of that messaging comes from what's going on in the world, locally, across our nation, and in the world. And I think people need to speak and communicate and talk about things that frighten them, and make sure that those important messages of being on guard against evil are always remembered. I want to thank Salem State University, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, for continuing this important work and continuing this important message. And I'm very honored as the mayor of the City of Peabody to continue to have this event here. Thank you for letting me be a part of this meaningful evening. Thank you.
At this point, I would like to call up Mary Kiley, who will be presenting a presentation about her travels to Mount Housing concentration camp in memory of Sonia Whites.
Tell Sean to start with the presentation.
Good evening. Having a contingency of 22 students and 3 chaperones from St. John's Preparatory School in Danvers, where I'm a faculty member, visit the Dachau and Monthausen during a 10-day tour of Europe last June was only appropriate. After all, survivor Sonia Whites enjoyed a long relationship with the prep, starting as a prep parent to son Donnie some 50 years ago, to telling her story to freshmen every year, almost 20 years. We figure she probably told her story just at the prep alone to about 6,000 14-year-old boys. As Sonia's legacy partner, it was very moving to have the prep support to go to Monthausen, specifically to visit there and finally give Sonia's beloved father, Yannick Schreiber, a long overdue memorial service. When we got out of our buses, we were hit with both a hazy hot breeze and a hauntingly beautiful landscape, as you can see. the industrial city of Linz in the horizon, located right between Salzburg and Vienna, was a telling backdrop for the entrance to the camp. It was from this city that victims, Sonia tells about it in her book, exited cattle cars and began their march through town up the very long sloping hillside to Mauthausen. After being greeted by Mauthausen Memorial administrators, we were able to present them with my last signed and pristine copy of Sonia's I Promised I Would Tell for their extensive archives. They were very grateful to receive it. Thanks. We began our tour outside the camp gates. If you go right to the next one, please. Staring at an empty swimming pool, we were told by our tour guides that this was put in place to, as he said, help the Nazis relax, as this death camp was understood, even amongst the Nazis themselves, to be a difficult place to work. It was horrifying. We know from Sonia's book that she and her cherished older sister Blanca arrived at Mauthausen, their fifth camp, in May of 1945. Sonia in the book recalled the disarray, the craziness, the extreme overcrowdedness, the variety of prisoners, all while being really close to death with typhus. As God continued, as our God continued, it was painful to realize that on a hillside right beside where we were standing, off in the back there, where you can see the hillside, once stood a series of 3 subcamps, including Husen 1. This was the very place where their beloved father, Yannick, had been held. A relatively short walk from where Sonia and Blanca were, perhaps a leisurely afternoon stroll in another world. Although now, from researching this, it's extremely likely that Sonia, Blanca, and Yannick were, for a very brief period, geographically close. Of course, they never saw each other. Yannick was cruelly killed on March the 2nd, 1945, by an impatient Ukrainian capo who was gotten tired of his level of work. 2 days later, on March 4th, the SS guards and capos left. The next day, March 5th, American tanks entered the gates of Mauthausen, where they were greeted, to the wrong word, welcome, perhaps there's not a word, by the survivors themselves. Our memories, our lives, were carried on through the power of our good names. So it had become incredibly important to me to find Yannick's name within the vast hall of names. Even with the coded guide, it was not easy. Fortunately, several of my students felt my deep need to do so. We were on a limited time. And so they helped me, and we did finally find Yannick's name. We concluded this day at the Jewish Memorial to give Yannick a long overdue and much deserved memorial service. I spoke of Sonia's love for her father amidst the context of the horrifyingly tragic place where unspeakable violence and hatred was the minute-to-minute norm. I then read Sonia's poem achingly describing her only dance with her father, which, beyond irony, took place at HaShoah, the first camp. And I'm going to read this for you. It's entitled Victory. I danced with you that one time only. How sad you were. How tired, lonely. You knew that they would take you soon. So when your bunkmate played a tune, you whispered, "Little one, let us dance." we may not have another chance. To grasp this moment, sense the mood, your arms around me felt so good. The ugly barracks disappeared. There was no hunger, no fear. Oh, what a sight. Just you and I. My lovely father, once big and strong, and me a child, condemned to die. I thought, how long before the song must end? There are no tools to measure love, and only fools would fail to scale your victory. After the brief service, my students placed the memorial wreath and silently placed small stones on the memorial. At the conclusion, all 22 of them stood like little statues. Even though I'd said that we were concluded, they seemingly couldn't move. They only moved, many with tears and blanched faces, after I personally hugged each one and told them that it was okay. A strange coincidence hit me as I was leaving the camp. The date, June 23rd. I'm not good with dates. I did not plan this trip. As it turned out, I remembered, upon leaving, that it was Sonia's 7th anniversary of her death. This was not a singular coincidence. 6 years ago, again touring Europe with St. John's as a chaperone, I went to Dachau for the first time. In the midst of that experience, it hit me that it was Sonia's first anniversary of her death. May we all promise never to forget. Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to welcome up to the risers the Salem State Community Chorus. Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to invite Rob McAndrews to the stage to present a special recognition to Professor Marv Wilson. I got it.
Good evening. First, let me just say thank you to Mary. That was just beautiful, very kind. Thank you. Professor Wilson, Marvin Wilson, has been one of the bedrock foundations for the Holocaust Center from the very beginning. With your friend Sonia Weitz, Harriet Wax, who is also here tonight. I can recall sitting around the dining room in Harriet's house at our so-called board meetings, planning business, deciding who the speaker would be for our Holocaust events. To say it's been an honor having some association with you for all these decades is, to put it mildly. And as some of you might know, many of you may not know, that Professor Wilson is, I think, retiring soon, perhaps next month, after serving as a professor at Gordon College for only 55 years. Professor Wilson has been a speaker at our events here, and so he is certainly well acquainted with the importance of this event. As Chris said, the most important event of our calendar year. Professor Wilson has also provided opportunities for his students and for people from various congregations to trips to Israel, a country and a people dear to his heart, I know that. And I'm thinking of your good friend, Rabbi Sam Kenner of formerly of Temple Shalom at this moment too. So Professor Wilson, we want to honor you with this plaque, and I think Chris is holding it there, and I'm going to transfer the mic to Chris.
Right off of this. All right. So it says, we honor Dr. Marvin Wilson, a committed scholar, educator, and community leader for interfaith understanding, social justice, and human rights. His words and work for over half a century continue to inspire us in the struggle against racism, prejudice, and ignorance. April 9th, 2018, Yom HaShoah commemoration, Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies.
How do I get down?
I just want to add to Rob's comments that I met Marv Wilson on the board of directors of the Holocaust Center Boston North. And any debates or any issues that we had, discussion, intellectual or not, ended with Marv's wise wisdom. His wisdom was just unbelievable. He would cut right to the central question. We'd all look at him, and the decision was made. So Marv had that kind of leadership quality, and it was a real inspiration to me as a faculty member. At this time, I'd like to welcome up Kelly Couture, who will be reading from Primo Levi. Kelly is a graduate of the Certificate in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Salem State University. She also has a BA in history and has traveled with me to Europe. And she continues to be one of our most active participants in the community. She's a teacher in Linfield Middle School, and she'll be reading from Primo Levi.
This poem is titled If This Is a Man, written by Primo Levi, Italian Jewish chemist, writer, and Holocaust survivor. Levi has given us some of our most powerful writings on the Holocaust, including this poem. You who live safe in your warm houses. You who find, returning in the evening, hot food and friendly faces. Consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman, without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold, like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts. At home, in the street, going to bed, rising, repeat them to your children. Or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn their faces from you.
Thank you, Kevin. At this point, I would like to bring up to the stage Professor Lisa Malman, who is our Faculty Research Associate at the Center and Professor of English at Salem State University, teaches our comparative literature courses as well as literature of the Holocaust, and she'll be presenting the Sonia Schreiber-White's Upstander Awards.
It is truly an honor for me to present the Sonia Schreiber-White's Upstander Award. This award is named for our beloved Sonia Schreiber-White, poet, author, and a voice for a generation of Holocaust victims and survivors. Her mission of encouraging others to learn from the lessons of history and stand against all forms of prejudice, hatred, and indifference is beautifully realized in the actions of the young people we recognize this evening. Like Sonia, they have demonstrated a deep commitment to healing the world by refusing to stand by and passively witness the suffering of others. This year, we received a record number of applications for this award, and it was extremely difficult to choose one recipient. As such, I'm going to ask some honorable mentions to come up to the stage at this point as I say your name. Danielis Acosta. Jason Salona. Van Lauren Gico. Maya Evans. Sophia Fontaine. Liam Gillespie. Alessandra Ivy. Joanna Bondi. Aaron Mellon. Lil Montevecchi. Danielle Villarreal Reyes. And Nicholas Rosella. Thank you. The committee ultimately and unanimously chose Zoe Metzner, a junior at Masconomet Regional High School in Boxford. Zoe epitomizes Sonia's spirit in her kindness, compassion, tolerance, and wisdom. Just one example of this, When many in her class were watching 13 Reasons Why, a series on Netflix that focused on bullying and suicide, Zoe created and produced her own video entitled 13 Reasons to Take Care of Yourself, encouraging kids to take a break from social media and focus on positive activities. The powerful message of this video served to counteract the all-too-common focus in the media on bullying and discrimination. Zoe is also one of the founders of Mindful Youth in Topsfield, a program aimed at bringing middle and high school kids together to be more involved in their communities through activities such as volunteering at a walk to end sexual violence on campuses. These instances of courageous leadership come naturally to Zoe and are repeated in her everyday relationships with others. As Detective Kelly Pickering, the school resource officer who nominated her, said of Zoe, she is always the bigger person, doing the right thing even when no one else is looking. Zoe, could you please come forward and accept your award? It is also my privilege at this time to recognize John Workman, a remarkable teacher who is committed to bringing an awareness of the lessons of history to both his students and the larger community. John led the CHGS annual workshop on teaching the Holocaust, and as one of many local educators who worked with him on this project, I can attest to how well-deserved this honor is. John, can you also please join us here on the stage?
Thank you.
Thank you. Very humbled and grateful to receive this recognition. We're from Collins Middle School. Every year I'm fortunate enough to spend several weeks on a Holocaust unit, and although I have taught this unit for several years, every year a new group of students brings new thoughts and discussion to what I'm teaching. Today I brought along two students, Princessa and Joy, to briefly explain our unit.
Through the Holocaust unit that Mr. Workman teaches, we learn about empathy, tolerance, and about the choices we make as human beings.
We learn that we are responsible for our own choices. One choice we can make is to try to understand and empathize with others.
Helen Keller said, "The highest result of education is tolerance."
Learning should result in personal change. Tolerance comes from knowledge, understanding, and compassion.
In our unit, we read many texts about the Holocaust. We start by examining the themes found in picture books like the Harmonica and in the allegorical story, Terrible Things.
We also read Baseball Saved Us, which is a look at Japanese internment camps in America, and we look at Ansel Adams' photographs of Manzanar.
Our core class novel during the unit is Night, and we spent several weeks exploring Elie Wiesel's harrowing account of life in concentration camps. While the material is mature, students are always able to have meaningful conversations about his memoir.
We also read aloud the play version of the Diary of Anne Frank, and also read other excerpts of diaries that are collected in salvaged pages. We also read about art and poetry that was created during the Holocaust.
One of the books we used is in a collection of poems and art from the terrorism ghetto called I Never Saw Another Butterfly. Princessa and I would like to read the title poem from this book. The last, the very last, so richly, brightly, dazzlingly yellow. Perhaps if the sun's tears would sing against a white stone. Such a yellow is carried lightly way up high. It went away, I'm sure, because it wished to kiss the world goodbye.
For 7 weeks, I've lived in here, pent up inside this ghetto. But I have found what I love here. The dandelions called to me, and all the white chestnut branches in the court. Only, I never saw another butterfly. The butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live in here, in the ghetto.
Even though it's English class, we do learn some history of the Holocaust, so we can put literature into perspective. We've been fortunate enough to have guest speakers, including family members of survivors and witnesses to other genocides. Our unit culminates in a student performance. Students presented original poems, stories, dance, and artwork that they created during our unit. Thank you very much.
And finally, while we are honoring those who have gone above and beyond in their efforts to ensure that the lessons of history are well taught in our community, I want to offer thanks and recognition on behalf of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies to Eli Village, who played a pivotal role in bringing the legacy of the Ukrainian victims of the Holocaust not only to Salem State, but is also his own school, high school, the Waring School. Eli was instrumental in helping organize lectures both here and at Waring School by researcher and forensic anthropologist Patrice Ben-Simon, including traveling to France with Lisa Mullman as a liaison to Yahad and Enum, an organization founded by Father Patrick Dubois, devoted to unearthing, quite literally, the stories of Ukrainian Jews who were brutally massacred during the early years of the Shoah. Thanks to Eli, these stories will continue to resonate with the North Shore. Thank you, Eli. And now we'll go to the section of our program for memorial prayers. I'd like to invite up Cantor Alana Rosenfeld, Shirat Hayam, Swamscott.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to chant the memorial prayer first, which is on the next page. The translation is right below, but basically it asks that all of the souls that we are praying for, that we're thinking about, everyone who perished in the Holocaust, would be protected, comforted under the wings of the Shekhinah, of God's close and comforting presence. El Malachami Shocher Bayomi Hamitzei Menucha Nechuna Tachat Kanfei Shekhinah B'ma'arot Kedoshim
מיידנק, טרבלינקה, ושאר מחנות השמדה באירופה, שנהרגו ושנשרפו ושנשחטו ושנקברו חיים בכל מיתות משונות ואכזוריות על קדושת השם. ברור שאנחנו בניהם ובנותיהם, אחיהם ואחיותיהם, נודרים צדקה בעד הזכרת משפטותיהם. בגן עדן, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם, לכן בר הרחמים. יסתירם בסתר כנפם יועמים, ויצרו לחיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר Amen. We turn back one page for the Kaddish. I invite everyone to rise. Yitgadal Auschwitz, V'Kadash Baviyar Shemirabah Belza, Be'alma Dibarach Kirkutei Bergen-Belsen, V'Amlich Malchutei Buchenwald, B'Chayachol U'B'Yom Echol Chalmel, U'B'Chayei L'Chol Beit Yisrael Daka, Ba'adala U'B'Zman Kari V'Meru V'Osazur. Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevarach Le'alam U'Lamei Almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach Rosrozen, v'yitpa'ar v'yitroman Maltazen, v'yitnaseh v'yithadar Maidanek, v'yit'aleh v'yithalal Rabezbuk, Shemei Kudsha Birchu, Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata Sobibur, Tushbechata v'nechemata Shtutov, Damiran Yalma Vimaru Terzen. Amen. Yehei Shalom Rabbanim Shemaya V'chalim Aleinu V'Yakol Yisrael Vimaru. Amen. Oseh Shalom V'Romav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'Yakol Yisrael Vimaru. Amen.
May be seated.
Thank you. There's the point in our program where I have to, and I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Omar Bartov from Brown University. I have to say that every once in a while I get a vote in the executive committee. And between Dan Eschet, our program director, and myself, we voted very strongly to bring Omar Bartov here for our presentation, and we're really thrilled to have him here. I look out and I see all of my graduate students over here who've all read his books, discussed him late into the night in our seminars, and it's a real privilege to bring him here to talk to you. Omar Bartov is the John Birkeland Distinguished Professor of European History and Professor of German Studies at Brown University. Born in Israel and educated in Tel Aviv University and St. Anthony's College, Oxford, Omer Bartov's early research concerned the Nazi indoctrination of the Wehrmacht and the crimes it committed in World War II, analyzed in his books The Eastern Front, 1941 to 1945, and Hitler's Army. He then turned to the links between total war and genocide, discussed in his books Murder in Our Midst, a recent monograph. Erased investigates interethnic relations in the borderlands of Eastern Europe. His new book, Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Bucha, was published in January as the subject of his keynote address. Professor Bartov.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me here. And I have to say, this was a very moving event up to now. And I'd just like to thank the people who prepared it. The prayer right now, and the choir in particular, I found extremely moving. So I need to recharge and for my talk. I will be talking today about the book, as you heard, that was just published. And I'll try to go through some of the main themes that I dealt with in this book as briefly as I can. And perhaps we'll have some time for a few questions at the end. I began to think about this book in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, and you may remember that in the early 1990s, it was the end of communism. People told us that history had come to an end, and we were now in a perfect world. And shortly thereafter, in 1992, the mass killing in Bosnia began, and in 1994, a massive genocide that took place in Rwanda, the fastest genocide in history, about 800,000 people murdered in 10 weeks. Mostly by machetes and fire. This killing, of course, goes on. There's not that much coverage of it these days in our country. There are many other things that people are engaged in. But about 500,000 Syrian citizens have been murdered in the last few years, and the killing goes on. And so as this was happening in the 1990s, and this was also the period in which the Holocaust had come to be recognized as a major event in European history and was commemorated in many countries. A Holocaust Day, an international Holocaust Day, was recognized. Countries joining the EU committed to the memory of the Holocaust. While all of this was happening, the killing was going on. And I started asking myself, what are the links between the Holocaust and other genocides? We had learned and I myself have written about it, that in order to perpetrate genocide, there were certain necessary preconditions. One was that it was important to dehumanize the victim, to think of the victim as someone who was different from ourselves. Another was that some mechanisms had to be created that would distance the perpetrator from the victim. That there would be some kind of compartmentalization of the process so that you could take people from one place, pack them into a train next to a nice suburb, and they would disappear. And then the people who would take them off the train would not know where they came from. And the people who would take them into the camp would not know where the train had come from. And so that no one in particular would be responsible. And I asked myself, is this always the case? Because what we were seeing at the time in Bosnia and Rwanda looked somewhat different from that. And I thought that the one way that we could think about that would be to see how genocide occurs in one place, in one town. What actually occurs there? Because genocide is a very large thing. And the Holocaust, of course, was enormous. It was across an entire continent. It included whole states, whole administrations. And yet, there were people living in a certain town, and for them, the genocide was not what happened in that specific town. So I wanted to see what happened in such a town. So I had to choose a town. And I chose the town of Buchach. Now, why did I choose the town of Buchach? Well, first of all, it is a town in Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe was where most of the Jews had lived, and where most of the Jews were murdered. It was also the town of a well-known author of whom most Americans had never heard, who received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1966, but he wrote in Hebrew. His name was Shmuel Yosef Agnon, Shai Agnon. And as a teenager, I read his stories growing up in Israel in high school. He was on the curriculum. But not much of his work has been translated, although recently there have been some translations. So I knew about that town because I knew that Agnon had come from there, and he had written about it. And he wrote about it, although he left it when he was 21, he wrote about it for much of the rest of his life, and he saw it as encapsulating the entire history of East European Jewry, the Jewry that later on was destroyed. It was also the town of Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal, known as the Nazi hunter. And in fact, when I went to the archive, so-called archive, which was the small apartment in which he lived in Vienna, there was a very large folder there which was dedicated to the people who murdered his town of Buchach. Because he hunted down particularly those people who had been involved in the killing of his own family and all other Jews in Buchach. It was also the town of Immanuel Ringelblum, and Ringelblum was a very important historian of Polish-Jewish relations. And during World War II, he was incarcerated in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he established the archive of the ghetto called Onek Shabbat or Onek Shabbos, two-thirds of which were discovered after the war and made it possible to reconstruct the history of the destruction of the ghetto, because the Germans did not only want to murder the Jews, they also wanted to destroy the traces of the murder. And he made sure that that would not happen. But I had also a personal connection to that town because my mother came from Buchach. And in fact, in 1995, having thought maybe I should write on that town, I interviewed my mother. I asked her to tell me about her childhood. And it was the first time that I asked her about it, and it was the first time that she talked about it, because she had been waiting for me for 41 years, I would say 41, to finally ask that question. And when I asked her, she talked for an hour and a half, and fortunately I had a tape recorder ready. We even said maybe we should go back to Buchach, but shortly thereafter she fell ill, and she passed away in 1998. So we never went there. But that created also a personal bond with that town. And what she told me about the town and about her childhood was not about murder and killing. It was about a perfectly happy childhood. She spoke Ukrainian on the street. She studied in Polish in school. She spoke Yiddish at home. She would go to the forest to pick mushrooms and wildberries. It was not a bad childhood at all. It wasn't a story of anti-Semitism and hatred. It was a story of a nice childhood. She was born in Koshmiezhi, a small village on the Dniester near Buchach, and she stayed in Buchach until 1935. When she was 11, her father and her mother and her two brothers and herself boarded a ship to Palestine. This was taken just before they go to the ship, and they arrived there in December of 1935. Now, had she stayed, her fate would have likely been similar to that of the rest of my family. None of them survived. No member of my family who stayed behind came out. Many of them, as I later found out, were murdered with ample collaboration by their Polish and especially by their Ukrainian neighbors. And so I spent a good between 10 and 20 years on this book, and I want to tell you a few things about what I found out and and later on give you a little bit more of the history of this place. So the first thing that I realized was that on the local level, this notion of dehumanization, in the sense that you do not think of the people you kill as human beings before you kill them, did not exist at all. That in fact, the genocide was intimate. The killers knew the victims before they killed them. They often knew them by name. They knew them personally. That the killing was public, was visible, and was audible. There was nothing secret about it. It wasn't this notion that we have of distant extermination camps and no one sees what happens. It happened right there in front of everybody's faces. Very few members of the community could avoid exposure to an engagement in the killing. People saw everything that was happening and in one way or another were engaged in it. Investigating genocide on the local level revealed to me that it was not only an encounter between perpetrators and victims. My initial question, what happens in genocide when the perpetrators come to a town and start killing people there, was not exactly the right question, because they were not only Jews living in that town. It showed that the notion that we have, that there are, and we've created this for ourselves in part for our own sense of morality or for our own ethical convenience, that there are perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, is wrong, because bystanders don't really exist when you speak about genocide on the local level. Everyone is engaged. The question is the degree of engagement. Where are they on the scale between totally collaborating and completely resisting? And most people are someplace in between. And it implied, finally, that the nature of local genocide, and when I say local genocide, I mean genocide that happens in hundreds of towns, such as the town that I investigated. Basically what happened to about half of the victims of the Holocaust. The nature of local genocide, the way it is experienced by the community, and the manner in which it is subsequently remembered, had to do a great deal with the relationship between the different inhabitants of that town before the perpetrators came there. In this case, before the Germans arrived. And that's very important to understand. And so, for that, to understand that relationship, I will give you a very brief history of the town, and you will probably understand from this that the history of this town is the history of many, many towns across Eastern Europe, all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea and to the Balkans. This entire stretch of territory, which is now made up of many different countries. In Buchach, a town of about 15,000 people on the eve of World War II, there were three ethnic and religious groups that had been living side by side since the 1500s. There were Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews. The Ukrainians were, for a long time, referred to as Ruthenians. Buchach was initially a private town, owned by the immensely powerful, noble Polish family, the Potockis, located on the borderlands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a vast state that was at one point the largest state in Europe that nobody remembers. After the annexation of this part of Poland, known as Red Russia, by Austria in 1772, Buchach was located, this is moving independently. Just a minute? Okay. Never mind. I see that something is happening here. Okay, Buchach was located on the eastern part of the Habsburg Empire in an area known after the annexation as Galicia. And this was Eastern Galicia. It remained in this vast multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire until the collapse of the empire in the aftermath of World War I. During the interwar period, Buchach was located in the eastern part of Poland. Poland that had disappeared at the end of the 18th century, had been swallowed up by the empire surrounding it, was resurrected after World War I, and now Buchach was located in the eastern part of Poland, where the majority of the population, however, was not Polish, but Ukrainian. And that's very important to understand when we try to figure out what was going on there during World War II. Now, it's important to understand that the groups, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, who lived together in that area, had not known any other existence. They had always lived side by side. Now, while they kept their own distinct ethnic and religious customs, they also regularly interacted with each other. They often spoke each other's languages. Yet, we know that in World War II, they exercised extreme violence against each other. The violence was clearly also a consequence of the policies of external invaders and occupiers, Russians and Germans in World War I, Soviets and Nazis in World War II. But it was also the outcome of past ideological commitments, of prejudices, of resentments that long predated the invasion of foreign armies. At times, the internal violence had absolutely nothing to do with the external influence and the intervention from outside, but was generated from within. Because of that, it's important to understand the roots of this violence independently of the occupiers over a long stretch of time. It's also important to not to think of these regions, and we have a tendency, certainly in the West, to think of Eastern Europe, of that areas, as areas that were always violent, where people were always at each other's throats. In fact, for much of the period between 1700, the beginning of the 18th century, and World War I, there was very little violence in that area. It's also important to understand when we talk about a multi-ethnic and multi-religious region that it was not the way we would like to think about it today. It was not multicultural. It was not pluralistic. People did have a strong sense of the difference between one group and another, one religion and another. Groups were seen and experienced each other differently, even though there was a fair amount of overlap. And in this area, there was a great deal of overlap, particularly between Poles and Ukrainians. There was a great deal of intermarriage. The interesting aspect of intermarriage between Poles and Ukrainians was that when a Pole and a Ukrainian married, the boys would have the father's religion and the girls would have the mother's religion. And so the difference between the groups remained even though they intermarried. And that had rather dire consequences in World War II when there was inter-ethnic killing because people were being killed within families. So when does this violence begin? Well, in the second part of the 19th century, people began identifying themselves increasingly according to national categories. This is the rise of nationalism, and it's arrived in Eastern Europe in the second part of the 19th century. The main question becomes at this point, who belongs to this land and who does not? Or rather, to whom does the land belong and who is an alien, a colonizer, an invader? Polish nationalists at that point, and there's some famous writings on that I won't elaborate now, presented the Poles as carrying a civilizing mission in what they call the wild lands of the East, or Green Ukraine, Zielona Ukraina, and described themselves as thwarting the savagery of the Cossacks and the peasant uprisings, as particularly encapsulated the Cossack uprising of 1648, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Ukrainian nationalists presented Ukrainians as the indigenous population of the land. And spoke of the Poles as those who came to colonize their lands, who brought their own lords to these lands, helped by their Jewish lackeys. This was presented, you can find this presentation, if you know these stories, even in Nikolai Gogol's early 1835 novel Taras Bulba, and then it appears in Ukrainian national poetry and fiction in the middle and the late 19th century. Jewish discourse was somewhat more complicated. Most Jews did not speak of themselves as having any ownership of the land. They certainly spoke about themselves as having brought commerce, urban life, and prosperity to the region. But with some exceptions, Jews often spoke of themselves as being in transition. The story was that Jews were on the way to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. And they had stopped for the night in Poland and Ukraine. And they stayed there for 400 years, but they were basically in transition to the land of Israel. This is the one interpretation of it's wrong, but it's a good one, of Pauline, the Hebrew name for Poland. Pauline is we will stay overnight here. So they stayed for about 400 years. When Jewish nationalism begins, and it begins only in many ways in response to Polish and Ukrainian nationalism in the late 19th century, that is Zionism. When Zionism begins, Zionism speaks not of the land in which the Jews live as the land of the Jews. So when it speaks about land, it speaks about land elsewhere, that is in Palestine. There was one area of agreement between Poles and Ukrainians as they were discussing who does Galicia, this part of Poland, belong to. And that was that the Jews do not belong to it. And you find it very often, both in Polish and in Ukrainian national discourse. The Jews do not belong. But all this growing nationalism and antagonistic speech did not become violent until World War I. There's a great deal of talk and there's very little violence. What changes things is the outbreak of World War I. World War I put an end to the social order which was in large part maintained by the Habsburg Empire, that knew it was an empire of many nationalities, and it managed to balance one against the other. When the war begins, this entire social order begins to collapse. The war in this region, we often don't know much about it. Most of us know about the Western Front, but the war in that region was extremely violent. It displaced vast numbers of people, destroyed cities, and particularly the Russian occupiers were engaged in a great deal of population policies, of either deporting people to the interior of Russia or expelling them away into the west from lands occupied by the Russians, with particular violence against Jewish communities in Poland, Galicia, and Bukovina, and all this area of Eastern Europe. It's also important to understand that while the war, as we think of it, was fought between these great powers, on the local level it was seen completely differently. Poles who were serving in the Austro-Hungarian army were not serving to preserve the empire. They were serving in order to create an independent Poland, to resurrect Poland. They were serving in Polish national legions, and their goal was, at the end of the war, to have an independent Poland. Ukrainians serving in that same army were serving in order to create an independent Western Ukrainian Republic in precisely the same place. So they were fighting in the uniform of the Austrian army, and they were fighting against the Russians, but they were fighting to create their own independent entities. The only group that fought for the empire were the Jews, because they were afraid that if the empire collapsed, there would be nation states. And nation states would have no room for them. What is important also to understand is that in Eastern Europe, in this area, the war did not end in 1918. We know November 11th, 1918, the war ends. It ends in the West. In Eastern Europe, in this area, in Galicia, the war continues for a whole year in a battle, ongoing battles between, I won't keep this image up for a long time, so I'll move on, with vast atrocities between Poles and Ukrainians. This is a war that's fought between Polish and Ukrainian units, the same units that had fought in the Austro-Hungarian army, in order to establish to whom this area would belong. The Poles are better organized and they win. And so now, in interwar Poland, what we have is an area, all this eastern area that you're looking at, what you see in yellow, these are areas that are in Poland, but with a majority Ukrainian population, a population that had tried to gain independence, first from the Austrian and then from the Poles, and now finds itself under Polish rule and has been nationalized through this process and brutalized because, first of all, of the war of World War I, then the war between Poland, between the Poles and the Ukrainians, and now by ongoing Polish repression of Ukrainian nationalism, broken promises of autonomy, Polish colonization of this area. What this leads to is a growing distance between the different groups. And what you find is that as Poland is increasingly suppressing Ukrainian nationalism, Ukrainians are creating nationalist, underground nationalist organizations. The most important of which is created in 1929, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, known by its acronym as OUN, and OUN later on plays a very nasty part, both in the Holocaust and later on in the ethnic cleansing of the Polish population in this area. Now, at the same time, under Polish rule, there is growing anti-Semitism. This becomes exacerbated in the 1930s, particularly after the death of Józef Piłsudski, who was the quasi-dictator of Poland. He dies in 1935, and official Polish anti-Semitism and popular anti-Semitism is greatly exacerbated. This sense of no place for Jews in interwar Poland, and especially in its eastern parts, leads to a growing a growth of Zionism and attempts to leave this area. But what we have to understand is that the 1930s are a period of economic depression, and so it's very hard for Jews to emigrate, as we know if we think about discourse about refugees and immigrants nowadays. Countries are very reluctant to accept any Jews. In the United States, as of 1924, there's legislation particularly geared against immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe. In 1936, there is the beginning of the Arab Rebellion in Palestine. And as a result of that, the British mandatory authorities there restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine as well. So for Jews living in this area, there's a very strong sense of being completely unable to leave and unwanted where they are. This leads some of the youthful elements, a rather small group I must say, in Buchach to turn to communism, and a communist cell is formed in that area. It's almost purely Jewish. It's only within Buchach, it numbers about 20 people. They are unable to recruit any of the local Ukrainian population. Ukrainian peasants are not interested in being led by Jewish communists. And the one thing that we know about a few members of that group is that later on, under German rule, they turned to resistance, and most of them are killed. These two young men were members of the Communist Party of Western Ukraine, as it was called, in the 1930s, and later fought against the Germans, who really fought against Ukrainian nationalists under German rule, and were killed. Now, the last thing that's important to understand before we get to the German occupation is that between 1939 and 1941, as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Poland is divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And this area where Buchach is located is under Soviet rule. And what happens under Soviet rule in that town, as happens throughout this region, is not only that the Soviets very quickly destroy whatever economy there was there, and it wasn't such a prosperous economy to start with, they also begin targeted deportations of populations. They deport first Poles, they deport members of the Polish aristocracy and then of the elites, and then just other Poles, members of families of Polish army officers and so forth. Then they turn against the Jews, and they deport Jews either for social reasons, if they're more wealthy, or for political reasons, particularly if they're engaged in Zionism. And then they turn to deport Ukrainians. And on the eve of the German invasion, the Germans invaded the 22nd of June 1941. On the eve of the German invasion, there are thousands of mostly Ukrainian political prisoners in jails throughout this area. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, gets an order to either, as they are withdrawing from this area, either to take the prisoners with them or to shoot them. They obviously take the easy way out and they shoot them. And they kill thousands of political prisoners. This killing of prisoners in jail is construed by Ukrainian nationalists and immediately also by the Germans who march in as part of Judeo-Bolshevik crimes. And this triggers mass pogroms against Jews throughout this area, throughout Eastern Galicia or Western Ukraine. In the large cities, but also in the smaller ones. The major pogrom is in Lemberg or Lviv, and there's some photos of that. But it occurs also in smaller towns, including such towns as Buchach. Now, in all these towns, and this is specifically on Buchach, what is formed are Ukrainian militias. These have been already prepared beforehand. At the moment the Soviets leave, as they're leaving, Ukrainian militias organized by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, by OUN, formed in Buchach. About 100 men are formed from the various villages and in the town itself. They form themselves into an army, and they begin acting against former Soviet collaborators, against Polish activists, against Jewish activists, against elements of the Red Army that are still retreating. There is a sense among Ukrainian nationalists at this point that their time has come. Finally, they will have an independent Ukraine. They believe that the Germans will give them an independent Ukraine. None of that happens. Of course, the Germans have no intention of providing them with an independent Ukraine, but meanwhile, as you can see, Ukrainians are celebrating what they hope will be their freedom. Instead, what happens is that the Germans take these militias, these Sich militias as they're called, and transform them into police units, into auxiliary police units. These auxiliary police units become part of the apparatus of carrying out genocide in that area. And later on, in 1943, some of you may know, the Germans also recruit an entire SS division in this area, the Waffen-SS division Galicia, and this recruitment, these men who are recruited to that division are sent to fight the Red Army, and later on they join the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which is the military arm of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and they participate in mass expulsion of Poles and in the killing of the remnants of the Jewish population in that area. Now, another thing that you understand when you look at genocide on this level is that while the Germans come into this area and occupy it, they're extremely thin on the ground. In the area of Buchach and Chortkov, which is a nearby town, there is one German security police outpost. It numbers between 20 and 30 Germans, not all of whom are Germans from the Reich. A number of them are ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia, from Poland, from Lithuania. These 20 to 30 men, you can see, together with their wives, with their mistresses, with their children, carry out a mass murder of 60,000 Jews in that area alone. And this killing occurs mostly between late summer, early fall of 1942 and summer of 1943. Now, obviously, they cannot carry out all the killing on their own. And one has to understand that when they're not carrying out killings and they're not engaging in that the whole time at all, then they're having a mighty good time. They have very comfortable lodgings. They live in a highly bucolic area. It's very beautiful there. They have unlimited amounts of food, unlimited amounts of booze, unlimited amount of tobacco. There's a tobacco factory nearby, in fact. Unlimited amounts of sex. They can get sex, however, it's not very hard because they have complete power over life and death in that area. And when one looks at evidence provided in trials in Germany after the war, in the late 50s and 60s, one realizes that for these men, this was the best time of their lives. They came from low middle class origins or working class origins, and they went back to that usually. But at that time, those couple of years, 3 years that they were there, it was the best time of their lives. But in order to organize this killing, they have to have auxiliary forces. 20, 30 men cannot kill so many Jews in such a large area. And so what they do, they have an auxiliary battalion of Ukrainian policemen, many of them formerly nationalists who were in the militia, about 350 of them, who are based together with them in Chortkov, in this town near Buchach. And every once in a while, when they decide to raid a town, they drive to that town. It's surrounded by the militia, or this, what I call the Schuma, the Schutzmannschaften. That's the auxiliary unit. They're held by local police forces. These local police forces are German and Ukrainian and Jewish police in the area. They round up whoever they can. And in this area, the killing consists of, there are two methods. One method is right at the beginning, and that's only in the early phase of the killing, between late summer 1942 and the end of 1942. So it's only about 3 months. Jews are rounded up. Many of them are shot on the street where they live. The rest of them, the majority, are put on trains and sent to Belzec, which is the designated extermination camp. It's on the border of Ukraine and Poland. And so about half the population of Buchach and half the population of the entire area of Eastern Galicia is gassed in Belzec. But this happens only after a year of occupation, during which the Germans and the Jews get to know each other. The Jews serve as their tailors, as their barbers, as their dentists, as childcare providers, cleaners. They know them by name. There is a very close relationship. Once Belzec is closed, the killing begins in situ. In Buchach itself, there are two sites, and in these two sites, what happens is people are rounded up, they are led to one hill or another. There are two hills, I'll show you in a moment. There are pre-dug trenches there, and Jews are shot standing over these pits, and then covered up. And between 5,000 and 7,000 Jews in Buchach and Jews who were brought into Buchach from surrounding villages are killed right there in the town. They're killed there, they're buried there, and they're still there. This town, as many others, is surrounded by such mass graves. This continues until June 1943. In June 1943, this entire area is pronounced Judenfrei. It's free of Jews. But there's still Jews in the area, either in hiding or working in labor camps. And those are killed gradually over the intervening period until the Germans are kicked out of this area by the Red Army in spring, summer 1944. As you can see from this German era photo from April 1944, the killing sites are on both sides of the town. And if you're standing in the middle of the town, you can see both sides. If there's machine gun fire there, you can hear it. And many people went to watch what it looks like when you kill a lot of people. So there are many accounts also of watching the killings. Now, just a few words about the aftermath of this event. People have very different memories of this event, just as they experienced it very differently, and just as they came into it very differently. Ukrainians don't like remembering this period as a period in which there was a great deal of collaboration with the Germans. There's not much talk about that. And as you can see, these are members, known members of the OUN-UPA, of the Ukrainian nationalists in this area. Ukrainians remember very well what happened after the war. We talk about the Red Army coming to this area often as coming as liberators. This area was liberated. Ukrainians didn't think of that area as being liberated. For them, it was a second occupation. And it was a very brutal occupation. And in that, as the Red Army is coming in, and as Ukrainian nationalists are resisting it, the Soviets recruit whoever is left of the Polish and Jewish population into extermination battalions in order to run after, to chase after Ukrainian nationalists. And those nationalists and their families are deported in large numbers, those who are not killed, to Central Asia and to Gulags. So that is the memory of victimization that exists among Ukrainians in that area. What they don't remember are people like this fellow, Volodymyr Kaznovsky, who was the district attorney, who became the chief of the police under German rule and organized much of the Ukrainian part of the killing process. When the Soviets came to that area, as in many other places, the Soviet Extraordinary Commission investigated what happened there, exhumed some of the mass graves, and drew maps. These are more or less accurate of what occurred. But this disappeared very soon thereafter. The very few survivors of the Jewish community there, which numbered about 8,000 in 1939, there are about 60 people in this photo, put up a memorial on the Federal Hill, one of the hills on which the mass killing occurred in 1945, but that memorial disappeared. Soon thereafter, it was probably removed by the Soviet authorities, who did not like specific commemoration of Jewish victims. They spoke about Soviet citizens as having been victimized by the fascists. Instead, a forest was planted over this hill, and it's almost impossible to find one memorial that had been put up for one specific site of killing where about 450 people were killed. It's deep in the forest, there are no signposts, so you need a local guide to find it. On the other hand, on the same hill, there is a very large memorial for the Ukrainian liberation fighters, which is prominently displayed there and serves also for local ceremonies of commemoration. There's also on another hill a memorial for Stepan Bandera, who was the head of the radical faction of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. This obviously was put up only after the fall of communist rule, and it was finished only a few years ago. There's also in the former NKVD prison, there's now a museum commemorating the liberation fighters of OUN and UPA. These are the flags of Ukraine and the flag of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the black and the red. On the other hill, where much of the killing took place, which is the hill of the Jewish cemetery, the cemetery is not in good shape, as you can see. There's for many decades, there was no memorial there. You can see in the background is the other hill. So these were the two sides of the killing. The town is in the middle, between these two hills. One memorial was only a few years ago put up, a very small memorial, but now it's almost impossible to approach, and it's being damaged probably by locals because there's signs of damage on it. The Roman Catholic Church has been restored, but the Jewish synagogue, which was a major building in the middle of the town, was damaged in the war, was then demolished by a Soviet demolition team between 1945 and 1950, and the stones from that museum, from that synagogue, which is often mentioned in Agnon's stories, were used to build a kinotheater, a cinema in town, with the right kind of Soviet art, as you can see. There was one building left in Buchach which had any connection with its past as a largely Jewish town, and that was the Bet HaMidrash, the study house adjacent to the synagogue. It stood there until 2001, but in 2001, the mayor sent a bulldozer to demolish it to build a new shopping center. So that last remnant is gone. And if you come to Buchach now, particularly as you know now that there's a war going on in eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian patriotism, particularly in western Ukraine, is back and forth, and the flag that is now hovering over the ancient, the medieval Polish castle is the flag of UPA, the flag of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. So, in a sense, as I finish my book, history is back to its old tricks. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, for your words, your wisdom, and your history. Before we conclude and sing the HaTikva together, I would like to thank some folks who made this all possible. I'd especially like to thank Vinnie Raponi, who's a teacher here at Higgins Middle School, who brought us students, and they handed out all of the programs as you entered. So thank you very much, Vinnie and the students. I'd also like to thank Anna McCoy from the Pingree School, who donated some of the haiku poetry of her students. That's in your program book, and I hope you take that home and read it. Ronald Clare from Masconomet Regional High School really spearheaded the Sonia Schreiber-White's Upstander Awards and sent forward many students and collected it for us, and I'd like to thank her very much. And I'd also like to thank some of the staff and the students at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Sophia Perez, Jen Petz, Zoe Quinn, our program director, Dan Eschett, who worked so hard in putting this together and organizing it. Thank you. And last but not least, I would like to thank Kathy Hennessy, who's the program manager at the center, who really worked tirelessly for the last 2 months, putting everything together and making my job very easy. So Kathy. So I'd like to invite Cantor Alana Rosenfeld back to the stage to lead us in the HaTikva, and then we will end the ceremony. Thank you.
Rise.
Thank you, everyone. Have a safe trip home, and thank you for participating.